May 22, 1944, London. Peter Fleming sat in a basement office at MI5 headquarters reading intelligence intercepts that made no sense. The Germans believed Captain James Crawford was alive and transmitting radio messages from occupied France. They were deploying resources to track his location. They were analyzing his intelligence reports. They were making tactical decisions based on information they thought Crawford was providing, but Captain James Crawford had been dead for 18 days. Fleming was a playwright before the war. West End productions, character-driven dramas. He understood performance, understood how actors created believable people through voice, mannerisms, and psychological consistency. Now he was working for British intelligence, creating a different kind of performance. He was keeping a dead soldier alive through radio transmissions, making German intelligence believe they were communicating with a British agent when they were actually communicating with a theatrical performance designed to feed them false information. Crawford had been a real agent, had been parachuted into France on April 20th to conduct reconnaissance ahead of D-Day, had been captured by German forces on May 4th, had been interrogated, had broken under torture, had revealed his radio codes and transmission procedures. Before dying from injuries sustained during interrogation, German intelligence had captured his radio, had his codes, had his operating procedures. They could have simply shut down his network. Instead, they decided to run it as a double-agent operation, use Crawford's radio to transmit false intelligence to British handlers, feed London disinformation that would influence Allied planning. What the Germans didn't know was that British intelligence knew. Crawford had been captured. They had signals intelligence indicating his capture, had intercepts showing German forces had obtained his radio equipment, had identified the moment Crawford's transmissions became German-controlled, but the Germans didn't know that British intelligence knew. They thought they were running a successful double-agent operation. Actually, they were participating in a performance where British intelligence controlled both sides of the conversation. Fleming's job was keeping the performance convincing. He needed to respond to German transmissions as if he believed Crawford was still operational, needed to provide instructions that seemed like genuine intelligence tasking, needed to create a dialogue that kept the Germans engaged while feeding them false information that would influence their D-Day preparations. But he also needed to maintain character, needed to sound like a British intelligence handler communicating with a trusted agent. Any deviation from expected patterns would alert the Germans that the operation was compromised. The challenge was that Fleming wasn't a trained intelligence officer. He was a playwright. He understood character but not military intelligence procedures. MI5 had recruited him specifically because they needed someone who could create a believable fictional performance, not someone who could write accurate intelligence reports. They paired him with actual intelligence officers who provided operational content. Fleming's job was making that content sound like authentic communication between handler and agent, making the performance convincing enough that German intelligence never suspected they were receiving deliberately false information. The performance had been running for 18 days. Fleming had been transmitting as if Crawford was alive and operational, had responded to German queries as if they were Crawford's reports, had provided instructions that seemed like intelligence tasking, but actually guided the Germans toward false conclusions about Allied invasion plans. Every transmission was calculated. Every response was designed to reinforce German belief that Crawford was legitimate while subtly influencing their strategic assessments. But maintaining this performance was psychologically complex. Fleming was performing as an intelligence handler who believed he was communicating with a live agent. The Germans were performing as a captured agent reporting to his handlers. Both sides knew the other was performing but couldn't acknowledge it. The Germans thought they were deceiving British intelligence. British intelligence knew the Germans thought this. The entire operation was theater, where both audiences believed they were watching reality while actually watching carefully scripted performances. Fleming's theatrical training was essential. He understood that maintaining character required psychological consistency, that small details created believability, that the most convincing performances were ones where the actor fully inhabited the role. He wasn't just writing radio transmissions. He was performing the role of a British intelligence handler communicating with a trusted agent. Every transmission needed to reflect that relationship. Every response needed to sound like someone who believed Crawford was alive, operational, and providing valuable intelligence. The Germans were analyzing every transmission looking for inconsistencies. They were comparing Fleming's responses to previous communications Crawford had received before capture. They were checking whether British intelligence's instructions aligned with expected operational patterns. They were looking for any indication that London suspected Crawford had been compromised. Fleming needed to ensure his performance was so consistent that no analytical method would detect the deception. This required understanding Crawford's actual handler. Fleming reviewed all previous communications between Crawford and his real intelligence officer, studied the language patterns, the tone, the types of instructions, the operational procedures. He needed to replicate that communication style exactly. Any deviation would be suspicious. Any change in how instructions were phrased might alert the Germans that Crawford's network had been taken over by someone else. But Fleming also needed to guide the Germans toward specific false conclusions. The entire purpose of keeping Crawford's network operational was feeding disinformation that would influence German D-Day defensive preparations. MI5 wanted the Germans to believe the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Fleming's transmissions needed to reinforce this deception without being obvious about it. The information had to seem like legitimate intelligence that Crawford would naturally report, had to fit operational context, had to be valuable enough that Germans would act on it, but subtle enough they wouldn't suspect manipulation. On May 22nd, Fleming transmitted instructions requesting Crawford report on German defensive positions near Calais. The transmission was phrased as routine intelligence tasking, as if British planning officers wanted confirmation of German force dispositions in an area they were considering for invasion. The Germans received this transmission, analyzed it, concluded that British intelligence was focused on Calais, that Allied invasion planning was targeting that sector, that they should reinforce defenses accordingly. The transmission had worked exactly as intended. Fleming's performance as intelligence handler had been convincing enough that the Germans acted on information they thought they were intercepting. They didn't realize they were being guided toward false conclusions through carefully performed radio communications. They thought they were running a successful double-agent operation. Actually, they were being manipulated by a playwright who understood that the most convincing deceptions were ones that felt completely real. Fleming continued the Crawford performance through late May and early June 1944. Every transmission was carefully calibrated. Every instruction reinforced the deception that British invasion planning focused on Calais. The Germans remained convinced. They analyzed Crawford's reports, cross-referenced them with other intelligence sources, found that multiple indicators suggested Calais was the invasion target. They didn't realize that British intelligence was coordinating multiple deception operations, that Crawford's network was just one element of a comprehensive disinformation campaign. But maintaining the performance became increasingly difficult as D-Day approached. Fleming needed to provide instructions that seemed operationally relevant while avoiding anything that might accidentally reveal actual invasion plans. He needed to keep the Germans engaged without giving them information they could use. The balance was delicate. Too much useful information would compromise Allied operations. Too little would make the Germans suspicious that Crawford's network wasn't valuable. MI5 coordinated Fleming's transmissions with broader deception strategy. They provided him with specific disinformation to incorporate into Crawford's tasking. Fleming translated this material into believable intelligence handler communications, made requests for reconnaissance that seemed operationally logical, asked for confirmation of German force positions that reinforced false assumptions about Allied objectives, created a narrative through accumulated transmissions that guided German intelligence toward conclusions British planners wanted them to reach. The Germans responded enthusiastically. They believed Crawford's network was providing them insight into British planning. They were reading his handler's instructions as intelligence indicators revealing Allied intentions. They were deploying forces based on what they thought these communications revealed. Fleming was watching German intelligence make strategic decisions based on theatrical performance disguised as radio traffic, but the performance had psychological costs. Fleming was pretending to communicate with a man he knew was dead, was performing the role of an intelligence handler believing his agent was operational, while knowing the agent had been tortured to death weeks earlier. The cognitive dissonance was disturbing. Every transmission required him to inhabit a character who didn't know what Fleming knew, who believed Crawford was alive when Fleming understood he wasn't. The emotional distance required to maintain this performance was exhausting. Fleming discussed this with his MI5 supervisor in late May, explained that performing as someone who believed a dead man was alive was psychologically difficult. The supervisor was unsympathetic, explained that the operation was too important to suspend because the performer was uncomfortable, that Fleming's theatrical discomfort was irrelevant compared to the strategic value of keeping Germans deceived, that he would continue the performance until MI5 determined it was no longer operationally useful. This response clarified Fleming's role. He wasn't a valued intelligence asset whose well-being mattered. He was a tool, a performer whose emotional state was irrelevant as long as the performance remained convincing. MI5 would use him until the operation concluded, then he would be reassigned to other duties. His feelings about performing as a handler communicating with a dead agent were his problem to manage. The institution cared only that the performance continued effectively. Fleming continued. He had no choice. Wartime service wasn't optional. His specialized skills made him valuable for this specific operation. Walking away would mean court-martial for refusing intelligence duties during wartime. He was trapped in a performance he found psychologically disturbing, but couldn't escape. D-Day occurred on June 6, 1944. Allied forces landed in Normandy, not Calais. The invasion succeeded partly because German forces were positioned incorrectly. Hitler kept significant reserves at Calais, waiting for what he believed was the main attack. Those reserves weren't available to reinforce Normandy during the critical first days when the beachhead was vulnerable. The deception operations, including Crawford's network, had contributed to German force misdisposition. After D-Day, MI5 needed to decide what to do with Crawford's network. The Germans still believed it was operational. They were still analyzing transmissions, thinking they provided intelligence about Allied operations. Fleming could continue the performance, could keep feeding disinformation about Allied strategic intentions in France, could maintain the deception for weeks or months longer, but continuing required Fleming to keep performing as a handler communicating with an agent who had been dead for over a month. MI5 decided to continue. The strategic value of maintaining German belief that Crawford's network was operational outweighed any concerns about performer well-being. Fleming was instructed to keep transmitting, to continue providing false intelligence through the fictional Crawford, to maintain the character, until Germans either discovered the deception or MI5 determined the operation no longer provided value. Fleming performed through June and into July. The transmissions became surreal. He was providing intelligence tasking about Allied operations that had already occurred, was requesting reconnaissance of areas that Allied forces already controlled, was maintaining a fiction that was increasingly disconnected from operational reality. But the Germans continued engaging, continued treating Crawford's network as legitimate, continued making decisions based on information Fleming provided. The operation finally ended on July 23, when German intelligence captured documents revealing that Crawford had died in early May. The documents were from German interrogation records that had been in files German forces abandoned during their retreat from Normandy. Allied forces captured these files, circulated information about German intelligence operations to prevent compromised agents from being used unknowingly. Crawford's death was documented in these files. German intelligence saw the documentation, realized they had been communicating with a British-controlled network for almost 3 months. The German response was furious. They had been completely deceived, had made strategic decisions based on false intelligence from a dead agent's radio network, had deployed forces to counter threats that didn't exist, had been manipulated through performance so convincing they never suspected the deception. Their after-action analysis was scathing. Multiple intelligence officers were disciplined for failing to detect that Crawford's network had been compromised and turned. Fleming learned the operation had been exposed through routine MI5 briefings. He felt relief. The performance had finally ended. He no longer needed to maintain the fiction of communicating with a dead agent, could stop inhabiting a character who believed things Fleming knew were false, could end the psychological compartmentalization required to perform convincingly while knowing the performance was built on lies. But MI5's assessment was different. They evaluated the Crawford operation as highly successful. Fleming's performance had been so convincing that German intelligence never suspected deception until, presented with documentary proof, his theatrical skills had enabled a deception operation that influenced German strategic planning for 3 months. His ability to maintain character despite psychological discomfort had been operationally valuable. MI5 wanted to use him for similar operations in the future. Fleming refused. He had fulfilled his wartime service obligation, had done what was required, but he wouldn't continue performing as intelligence handler for fictional agents, wouldn't maintain characters built on the deaths of real people. The Crawford operation had been psychologically damaging. He needed distance from intelligence work that required that kind of performance. MI5 responded that his refusal would be noted, that his unwillingness to continue intelligence work would affect future assignments, that he was demonstrating unsuitability for classified operations. Fleming accepted this. He would rather be classified as unsuitable than continue work that required psychological compartmentalization. He found unbearable. He was reassigned to administrative duties. No more performance operations, no more character maintenance, just routine intelligence administration, paperwork, coordination, work that didn't require him to pretend dead people were alive. He finished his wartime service in these administrative roles, was released from military obligations in 1946. Fleming returned to theater after the war, West End productions, new plays. He resumed the career that had been interrupted by intelligence service. But the war had changed him. The performances he had done for MI5 had been different from theatrical work. had required psychological compartmentalization that stage acting didn't demand, had forced him to maintain characters knowing they were built on real deaths. The experience had been disturbing in ways that affected how he approached civilian theater. He wrote a play in 1948 about wartime intelligence operations, not about the Crawford operation specifically, that remained classified, but about the psychological cost of deception work, about people who maintained fictional identities for strategic purposes, about the emotional damage caused by living in constructed realities. The play was critically praised for its psychological depth. Critics noted that Fleming seemed to understand intelligence work from direct experience. He never confirmed this, never discussed his MI5 service publicly. The Crawford operation remained classified for decades. Fleming was prohibited from discussing it. The techniques he had used were considered potentially valuable for future operations. MI5 didn't want the methodology revealed, didn't want potential adversaries to know that Britain had successfully run deception operations by having performers maintain fictional agent networks. The operational details were sealed in classified archives. Fleming died in 1976 at age 68. His obituary mentioned his theatrical career, his wartime service in unspecified intelligence roles, his post-war plays including the critically praised intelligence drama. Nothing about performing as a handler for a dead agent. Nothing about maintaining the Crawford fiction for 3 months. Nothing about the psychological cost of that performance. Those details remained classified. Declassification began in 1988, when British intelligence released World War II deception operation records. Researchers found documentation of the Crawford network, found that the agent had been captured and killed in early May 1944, found that his network had continued operating under British control for 3 months after his death, found references to a civilian performer who had maintained communications as the agent's handler. Cross-referencing identified Peter Fleming. Academic papers published in the 1990s analyzed the Crawford deception, documented how Fleming had used theatrical techniques to maintain a convincing performance, how he had studied previous communications to replicate the handler's style, how he had incorporated disinformation while maintaining character consistency, how the performance had been so convincing that German intelligence never suspected they were being deceived until shown documentary proof of Crawford's death. Military historians calculated operational impact. The Crawford network had been one element of the broader D-Day deception campaign. Its specific contribution was reinforcing German belief that Calais was the invasion target. This belief had influenced German force disposition. Hitler had kept 2 divisions in reserve at Calais that could have reinforced Normandy. Those divisions weren't committed to combat until June 10th, 4 days after the invasion. By then, Allied beachhead was secure. Conservative estimates suggested that German delay in committing these reserves had reduced Allied D-Day casualties by 800 to 1,500. Fleming's performance maintaining the Crawford fiction had contributed to that delay, but the analysis also documented psychological costs. Fleming's MI5 file contained his supervisor's notes about his emotional state during the operation, about his discomfort performing as someone communicating with a dead agent, about his refusal to continue similar work after Crawford operation ended, about MI5's assessment that his psychological reaction indicated unsuitability for future deception operations. The file revealed that Fleming's theatrical success had been achieved despite significant personal cost. Theater historians researching Fleming's career found his 1948 intelligence play particularly interesting in light of the Crawford operation. The play's protagonist was an intelligence officer maintaining a fictional identity who experienced psychological breakdown. The character's deterioration was described with clinical precision, with understanding that suggested direct experience. Critics in 1948 had praised Fleming's psychological insight. Researchers in the 1990s understood that insight had been autobiographical. Fleming had been writing about his own experience maintaining the Crawford performance. The play had a scene where the protagonist explained that performing deception wasn't like stage acting. Stage actors created characters knowing the audience understood it was performance. Intelligence performers created characters that audiences believed were real. That difference created psychological stress. The performer had to maintain the fiction while knowing it was fiction, had to inhabit a character completely while remaining aware the character was false. The cognitive compartmentalization was exhausting, eventually unsustainable. Fleming had written this scene in 1948, 2 years after leaving MI5. The dialogue reflected his Crawford experience directly. He had performed as an intelligence handler while knowing he was performing, had maintained character consistency while being aware the character's beliefs were false, had inhabited a role completely while retaining awareness that the role was constructed. The play's protagonist described this as psychologically destructive. Fleming had clearly found it psychologically destructive himself. Modern theater and psychology researchers have analyzed Fleming's work in the context of the Crawford operation. They note that theatrical performance requires psychological techniques similar to those used in intelligence deception. Both require creating convincing characters. Both require maintaining consistency under observation. Both require the performer to inhabit roles fully. But intelligence deception adds a dimension that stage acting doesn't. The performance has real consequences. Failures don't just affect artistic quality, they affect operational outcomes. People live or die based on whether the performance convinces. Fleming had understood this, had known that his Crawford performance directly influenced German strategic planning, that his convincing character work contributed to German forces being positioned incorrectly for D-Day, that his theatrical skills were being weaponized to kill people through deception. That understanding had created psychological burden that stage acting never imposed. Theater was consequence-free performance. Intelligence deception was performance where success meant deaths. That moral dimension had disturbed Fleming deeply. His post-war writing reflected this disturbance. Multiple plays dealt with themes of deception, performance, and moral responsibility. Characters who maintained false identities and suffered psychological consequences. Protagonists who used performance skills for harmful purposes and couldn't reconcile that use with their self-conception as artists. Critics praised Fleming's exploration of performance ethics. Researchers now understand he was processing his wartime experience, was trying to reconcile his theatrical skills with how they had been used to enable military operations. The actor who fooled the Abwehr by playing a dead soldier for 18 days proved that theatrical performance could be weaponized for intelligence operations, that maintaining fictional characters required psychological techniques that stage actors possessed, that convincing deception was possible when performers fully inhabited roles, but he also proved that this work carried psychological costs that institutions didn't acknowledge. Fleming had been recruited for specialized skills, had been used until the operation concluded, had been assessed as unsuitable for continued service. When he refused to continue work that damaged him psychologically, the institution had valued his performance, hadn't valued his well-being. Peter Fleming performed brilliantly, maintained the Crawford character so convincingly that German intelligence never suspected. Deception, until documentary proof forced acknowledgement, contributed to D-Day success by influencing German force disposition through theatrical techniques applied to radio communications, saved an estimated 800 to 1,500 Allied lives through performance that kept German reserves positioned incorrectly, and paid for this success with psychological damage that affected his remaining 32 years. He wrote about it obliquely, created plays exploring the moral cost of deception, tried to process through art what he couldn't discuss because of classification, and died 12 years before researchers declassified the Crawford operation, and understood that his post-war plays about psychological cost of intelligence deception had been autobiographical, that the actor who fooled the Abwehr had been psychologically destroyed by the performance that made him successful, that maintaining a dead man alive through radio transmissions had required him to compartmentalize his own humanity in ways that couldn't be undone after the operation ended. Fleming saved lives through performance. The performance saved him nothing, just proved that the most convincing deceptions are the ones that destroy the performers who create them.